Welcome back everyone to another video on the Vixen Victory channel. Today we're going to be talking about a Heizou guide, quickly just looking over him as a character, how he's going to work, how you guys should be building him, and mainly we're going to be talking about him because him, Fischl, and Yao Yao are the 4 stars on this banner. And as we've already done Neuvillette and Zhongli, now we're going to head over to the 4 stars before the new banners do come out in the next few weeks. So as we are talking about Heizou, the first thing you guys want to keep in mind is that Heizou is an Anemo DPS. So as though he is kind of a 4 star, you'd actually be kind of surprised the amount of damage that he can actually output, even though he is a 4 star character and usually following that DPS route as a character. And there's plenty of different teams that you can run with him, and if anything, a lot of the characters that he uses, you can go with a traditional route that I'm going with, which is just a high volume of amount of damage. But honestly, there's a lot of other ways to make his even swirl numbers do big damage instead of what I do, which is just increasing the actual Anemo hit that he does as well. So there's a lot of different things and different ways to actually build him, in the sense that you can make so many different teams because he wants to have a lot of different elements that are in the core 4, so Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, and Electro, so that he can swirl as many times as possible, either creating that reaction a lot to just do more damage, or to use that reaction a lot to get him stacks like I use it for. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right in and talk about him as a character, looking at his talents and looking at how you should be looking at leveling priority. Now for me personally, all I really care about with Heizou is going to be the level of his skill. Now technically you can go into the normal attack, and if anything, the normal charge attacks that he uses as well as the skill is going to be the major way that you get most of his damage, whereas his burst is just kind of that extra piece to his kit that you don't really necessarily have to use. Yes, whenever it's there, you probably do want to use it, but honestly, the normal and charge attacks from the normal attack talent, as well as the skill, are going to be the major ways of how you're going to be using him. You should be focusing on your normal attack and your skill to really level into, with the burst lacking behind them. I usually focus the most on the skill hit here, but with him using these normal attacks, I would still say to level it just as much, if not a little bit higher than even what you have your burst at. As you can see here, I have a level 8 normal attack with a level 8 plus 3 on my burst, so they're the same level, and then my skill is about a level higher. Looking at his normal attack talent though, it's pretty basic, nothing really crazy. He just is a catalyst character, so all of his hits are going to be Anemo focused, which is even better, and that's another reason why you don't really have to worry about an infusion, just because he can give himself that infusion with his catalyst at every hit that he does. Looking at his skill though, he has 2 versions to his skill, a tap and a hold version. The tap version, he wields the Swift Winds to launch a Heartstopper strike that deals Anemo damage. The hold version, on the other hand, can charge energy to unleash an even stronger blow, and he will obtain the declension effect while charging, which will increase the power of the Heartstopper strike hit that you would do in the regular tap version. When the skill button is released or the skill finishes charging, so once you get, I'll show you how that kind of works, he will then strike forward, dealing Anemo damage. And we'll look at the declension effect in a second. Now, with him as a character, you can see I have nothing really here. Earlier, you probably saw an effect on the side of him, but if I just did an initial hit, you'll just see a damage number go here. Obviously, we'll wait for the cooldown to kind of happen with his skill, but that's the major way of how he's kind of used, right? Is you're just using your skill over and over again. But that's the tap version, just a normal punch right in the air. But with his skill, as you hold it, you see on the left side the numbers that are slowly increasing. Those are your declensions, or those stacks that you actually get for your declension effect. Now the idea here is to get 4 of those, and immediately you will get thrown up. Now looking at the declension, you can see here it increases the power of the next Heartstopper strike, which is just that huge hit at the end of his skill. Then you'll have a max of 4 stacks, meaning that you can possess 4 declension stacks. So you saw those kind of like 4 arrows like light up one after the other, kind of like top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right on the side of Heizou. After that, the conviction effect will then be produced, in which case the next Heartstopper strike will be an even stronger hit, as well as have a larger AoE. What that means is if you go over here with his skill, and you only have 2 of those being charged, it'll take into effect, actually with his skill attributes, higher damage based on the amount of stacks that you have. What I mean is the initial damage hit is basically right here in the skill hit. That's your tap of your skill. If you just tap the skill, he'll do 450% of his attack as damage. But if you look at it a little bit closer, and in the other parts, each of those arrows that he gets out of 4, you'll get 113.8% per stack attack on top of the 455. So if you have 3 of these, you would just multiply the 113.8 times 3 and add it on top of the 455. Now you're starting to see why, even though as a 4-star character, his damage can be absolutely insane. Never mind on top of that, if you have 4 of the declension stacks, you're going to be taking, obviously, 113.8 times 4, added on top of the 455, and because you have all 4, the conviction effect is now in place, which means you have a bigger AoE hit, but you also have this extra damage bonus to add on top of that number. So not only are you adding the 455 plus 4 of these 113.8s, you're adding on top of all of that, those 5 different numbers, you're now adding a 227.5 on top of that as well. Now looking at the burst though, it states that he will basically do a big AoE Anemo damage hit. Now he does kind of do like a kick animation that kind of throws it into place, but basically this is a vacuum slugger, and when vacuum slugger hits opponents affected by hydro, pyro, cryo, or electro, which is another reason why you might want to use some other characters that might influence putting some elements on the opponents, these opponents will then be afflicted with the Windmuster Iris effect. This Windmuster Iris effect will explode after a moment and then dissipate afterwards, dealing AoE damage of the corresponding aforementioned elemental type. So by having other elements in there, you can add even more damage on top of what he already initially does. The Vacuum Slugger can afflict a maximum of 4 opponents with the Windmuster Iris effect as well. A single opponent cannot be under the effect of Windmuster Irises or of different elements at the same time, so you can't have like Hydro and Pyro on the enemy. It won't have both, hits happen at the same time. It'll only use one of those. When you look at the damage numbers here being at 600% plus a little bit later, it's a pretty big damage hit. But when you take into effect the Heartstopper Strike hit, yes, the tap version is going to be lower than that, but as soon as you start adding at least 2 or 3 of these stacks from Declension, it is already higher than what you get in the burst. Never mind when you put 4 of these on, that's about another 450 something on top of the 450 something already. So you have about 900%, if not, about 910. Then you add 227.5 on top of that, so you're at 1100%. So you can start to see how big this damage number can really get compared to what he does in the burst, being just around half of what he would do at the full stopping power of the Heartstopper Strike in his skill. So there's a lot to see with Heizou, and the great thing about his burst is that it's very much like Wanderer or whatever, where it's just a burst that you just use, where it's just kind of something extra, not something that you really focus into too much, and it's also nice that it does have a low energy cost because of it. Looking at the first passive talent, we see when Heizou activates a swirl reaction while on the field, he will gain 1 declension stack for the Heartstopper Strike. This effect can be triggered once every 0.1 second. So as you see with the other characters in my team I even have some characters that are throwing constant elements that are one of the core 4, Hydro here, being thrown out all the time, so that no matter what, Heizou can constantly swirl, giving him more of those declension stacks a lot quicker instead of me having to sit there and charge for 5 years. So what that kind of looks like, if I can go find something really quick, here we go. And I don't even have, it doesn't have to be, another opponent or whatever, as long as they have this other element already applied to them. So if I go ahead and just use Farina to go throw on, you see I have 2, and then 3, and obviously wait a little bit longer, and 4, and now I have full stacks. Now I can just immediately use the skill without having to use anything. So there's a lot of a different way to really run with the characters and kind of use them to your advantage, using the other characters in the party to your advantage, and that's the major way of using Heizou, especially with those core 4 characters. Looking at the second passive talent though, it states that Heizou's Heartstopper Strike, when it actually hits an opponent, it will increase all party members' elemental mastery by 80 for 10 seconds. Obviously not giving it to Heizou himself. Now this might not be necessarily an insane number, but if you do have other characters in the team that are creating like vaporizes or melts or something like that, if you're using cryo and pyro characters to give Heizou just the stacks mainly for the declension to make the life easier, or if they have a certain buff that you want to give to Heizou, like Shenhe or something like that, kind of doing something along with maybe Mavuika in the future, maybe you just want some of that, they're still creating some extra, reactions off field possibly. And by increasing their elemental mastery, you are increasing the ability for them to, have a little bit of a higher hit, especially from off field. And even a character like Farina as well that I have, if you have like an off field pyro character like Dia or something like that, or Xiangling, then it also could create some pretty nice vaporizes for either one of them, especially on a character like Xiangling that already likes it. Giving her more EM is extremely good, and it's like kind of a on-field character doing this for the off-field character, so it's kind of nice to see that extra damage hit that you do. Also after that though, really overall with Heizou, like I stated, you're going to be throwing a core 4 in here. You don't have to obviously run the setup, we'll talk about teams later, but that's kind of the idea with how you're going to run him and how his talents actually work. Let's look now at weapons. There are plenty of different weapons to really run with him. My favorite weapon was probably Lost Parrot of the Sacred Winds. I love the high amount of crit rate with the high base attack. You increase your movement speed by 10%, which you don't really care too much about. But while you're on the field for a maximum of basically 16 seconds, you get like a 32% elemental damage bonus, which can be pretty helpful. But you have to stay on field for an extremely long period of time, which with Heizou, you're doing constant normal and charge attacks once your other characters are kind of set up. And yes, once you do your skill, you're just kind of waiting for your skill to come back. But if those characters have long, like durations of skills or off-field application, like a character like Farina, it's pretty easy to stay on field with Heizou for a long period of time. So with Lost Prayer of the Sacred Winds, I would say it's a pretty solid weapon. Obviously, there are plenty of other characters that can work as well, like Tome of the Eternal Flow. This does have a high crit damage main stat, overall, looking at the weapon. And overall, looking at anything that has a high crit stat can be extremely helpful, but the ability kind of lower here doesn't really help too much. But if you are running him with a character like, either if you're just getting hit a lot, or if you're running him with a character like Farina, technically this weapon can be helpful. When HP increases or decreases, charge attack will be increased by 14% for 3 stacks. So this weapon can be helpful. The energy isn't really necessarily that great, considering Heizou, once again, doesn't really care too much about it, but something like this weapon can actually be pretty good for him. He ascends into Anemo damage bonus, so having a crit weapon is not necessary, but I would say it's pretty borderline necessary in my personal opinion, just to make a pretty good kind of fit go overall together. Another weapon that's worked extremely well in my testing has been Tule's Remembrance, which is Wanderer's weapon, has a high base attack, has a crit damage main stat, overall, and you're faster attacking a little bit more with the normal attack speed increase, but honestly your normal attacks are increasing in damage as well, so that's helping a little bit. As you do your normal attacks, they are doing more damage, and like I stated with Heizou, you're doing constant normal attacks while you're fighting, and you even saw as I'm doing normal attacks and creating swirl reactions with the other characters. That's the whole idea. As I get ready for my Heartstopper strike with my skill, my normal attacks are still going to be there, and it's nice to have an extra normal attack damage bonus buff. But if you're a little bit more on the idea of charge attack hits, that can also still work, and those do swirl as well. You might just have to watch out for your, stamina a little bit, but overall that can still work pretty well as well. There are plenty of other weapons that can work, Skyward Atlas. If you have a lot of those other 5-star weapons that you're not really using and they're meant for another DPS and they have either crit or attack percent on them, even someone like Kagura's Verity, when you look at Yaemiko's weapon. Crit damage main stat weapon, increasing elemental skill damage, that's pretty helpful. Cashflow Supervision, which is Risley's weapon, that's also helping normal and charge attack damage. It's crit rate main stat, it increases attack. That would also work extremely well with Farina, probably better than something like Tome of the Eternal Flow, just because Tome of the Eternal Flow has, a lower kind of, base on looking at like HP percent, so it's maybe a little bit lower than Cashflow Supervision, whereas, with Cashflow Supervision, you're increasing attack, so it actually can be pretty helpful and useful. Looking at 4 stars though, a little bit beyond that, the weapon that I have initially on him is going to be Solar Pearl. Before I had, Solar Pearl on him, I actually had Lost Prayer of the Sacred Winds, and I just switched over to Yaemiko having it just because I wanted a little bit of a better crit ratio on my Yaemiko, but still, Solar Pearl, although it is not a free-to-play option, is probably his best weapon alongside of something like Widsith. Widsith with the 55.1% crit damage. Yes, the EM is not really that useful, but keep in mind he is swirling consistently, so those numbers can get a little bit higher. It can be helpful. I'm not a fan of making Heizou's swirl damage high because it is a little bit difficult to actually make the numbers useful, but I know that people do it, so this weapon can be helpful. The attack percent is helpful, the elemental damage bonus is helpful, and if you care about the swirls, the EM is helpful as well. Although you do have a 20-second cooldown overall when you're getting ready for the next buff, it is still a pretty good weapon, especially just at least for the main stat. Obviously though, like going back to Solar Pearl, I still do think it's better because the normal attacks increase elemental skill damage as well as your burst, so it feels like that kind of helps out, as well as when you do the skill and your burst, then your normal attack damage is also increased as well. So it's kind of the skill and the burst. This 4-star weapon was borderline made for him. It perfectly fits his aesthetic as well. Looking a little bit later, I know once again though that those people that like to have maybe a little bit more focused on EM, if you look here with Mapamare, it does have a main stat of EM, but also the ability, it's probably if you're looking for an EM weapon because you want really high swirl numbers with him, or it's maybe the only weapon you have, it's still a pretty solid weapon, and not only for the main stat, but also for the ability on it. Triggering an elemental reaction, which that swirl happens so much, will grant a 10% elemental damage bonus for 10 seconds with a max of 2 stacks, getting an easy 20% elemental damage bonus for him, which I think is definitely worth it overall. Yes, there are plenty other weapons that you could use, something like Flowing Purity, something like Favonia's Codex, just for more energy particles, either for your team or whatever, I guess, for some odd reason. Hawkshin Ring could work. There's plenty of other weapons that you, I guess, could just use. I wouldn't necessarily say that they're going to be the best, but they are other weapons that you can use as a DPS. As reaction based though, you're probably going to go for something a little bit different, focusing on a lot of that EM that I was talking about before. Something like Mapamare is probably going to be best for you. Now looking beyond kind of the idea with weapons, let's go ahead and talk about artifacts. Now, in my personal opinion, from what I've seen and even tested myself, I've tested this a lot, and it does depend a little bit more on what you want. If you are a person that wants, once again, a lot of that reaction DPS type idea, the 4-piece Viridescent is going to be best for you. The 2-piece is increasing Anemo damage bonus by 15%, and the increase to swirl damage by 60%. He does swirl a lot, so that damage is increasing, but the Anemo damage that he actually does, once again, that Heartstopper strike hit is not increasing for swirl. But it does decrease the opponent's elemental resistance to the element that he swirled with by 40% for 10 seconds. So it can be pretty helpful, it can be useful, but in my personal opinion, I'm not too much a fan of it because I don't want the reaction DPS on my account. That being said, for those people who actually do want that, this can be helpful and useful for you. So if you decide that, honestly, I really do want this, the 4-piece Viridescent does work and can work extremely well. But besides that, my other set that I actually like, and possibly even more, is either a 2 or a 4-piece of Golden Troop. The 2-piece states that increases elemental skill damage by 20%, which he absolutely loves, and the 4-piece states that increases elemental skill damage by a further 25%. And then additionally, when not on the field, elemental skill damage will be further increased by 25%, which you don't care too much about, considering that he's not going to be on field doing any skill damage, and that effect will be cleared 2 seconds after taking the field though. So if you can pop him on field and immediately use his skill, you could possibly get this buff, but you would have to make sure that he's insta-swirling, which is going to be very, very difficult for him to do. There is another set that you could use, the 4-piece of Mère Chancée, especially if you are running him with someone like the Farina that I'm using. If you're running that, this is probably my secondary choice because the normal and charge attack damage is getting increased, which he likes, and the 4-piece is giving a bunch of crit rate. Farina is changing your HP. You have a healer most likely in the team already, so you're already getting a bunch of crit rate change or HP change, which is giving you a bunch of crit rate, allowing you to focus a lot more on crit damage and possibly some other stats that you might find needed and necessary. The other thing is that once again, he does not ascend into any of the crit really, so he's just focusing on Anemo damage when he ascends, so focusing maybe on a little bit of crit in a 4-piece set might actually be worth it. For me though, I found that I actually like to have the 2-piece Anemo damage bonus set and the 2-piece elemental skill set. I have really, really good stats on each of the pieces, and I also have some pretty good, just overall, I like how this kind of build works and fits kind of well. If I have to use Heizou outside of Farina, I don't have to feel like I'm strapped to a 4-piece Mère Chancée, and at the same time, it doesn't feel like I'm a reaction DPS when I'm strapped to the 4-piece of Viridescent. Also, it just doesn't feel like if that's really your type of thing, you don't have to worry about it. The other thing is he already ascends into Anemo damage bonus, and he gets an Anemo damage bonus goblet most likely. So the idea with an Anemo damage bonus 2-piece might not be up your alley, so go for maybe another 2-piece of attack percent set or something like that might be helpful. And if you really care about a lot of that EM stuff, maybe go for a 2-piece of an EM set to maybe increase the swirl damage numbers that you're doing. But I think that overall, this is the best way that I've kind of seen my Heizou perform. I know that the 4-piece Viridescent is probably the most liked, and it is, and then also the 2-piece Glad with the attack percent increasing with obviously the 2-piece Anemo damage bonus, and even a Shimenawa's with a 2-piece attack as well. If your Heizou is stuck to your Farina, 4-piece Mare Chaussee can work pretty well. And also, though, I do think, though, that the 2-piece and 4-piece of Golden Troop is a little bit slept on, but I do think that it does depend a lot on majorly what stats you have. With Heizou, it doesn't matter necessarily too much on which set you use, in my opinion. I think, honestly, what matters more is the stats that you have. So just pick and choose the best 2-piece, or even 4-piece set that you have that really has the best stats and go with that. Now looking at the main stats for the Sands, Goblet, and Circlet, attack percent Sands on the Sands here, it's really not even a close debate. Even the people who go for a reaction-based character with Heizou don't even put an EM Sands on here. And then with the Goblet, I know that it is a little bit of I was a little bit surprised, I think, overall when I saw the stats a few weeks ago. And that was because, once again, he ascends so much into Anemo damage bonus. And most people are running that 4-piece of Viridescent, which made me believe that I thought that most people would go with an attack percent Sands to maybe balance out all the Anemo damage bonus that you were getting. But a lot of people still go for it. And in my personal opinion, from what I've seen, I have another attack percent Goblet that works pretty well and similarly to the stats. And I just felt that this one actually does work pretty well. So I do think that the Anemo damage bonus Goblet works a little bit better than the attack percent, but it does depend on what you have. And then obviously with the Circlet, going crit rate or crit damage, following a pretty good solid crit ratio. If you do have Mare Chaussee, you're probably going to go for a crit damage Circlet, but it all just depends on making sure that this ratio looks nice. Trying to get around 60% crit rate, and then anything higher is going to be nice as well. Because he is focusing on that one hit, you want to have maybe a little bit of a higher crit rate because you're afraid that you won't hit it. That's totally fair as well. I think when I had him originally on the other crit rate weapon, it was a little bit different, so my ratio was a tad bit better, but a 65 or whatever, that's about what we're used to with him. But even still, sitting at a different kind of ratio doesn't really matter too much, because honestly, with the characters that he's running and the other buffs that he's getting from the other characters, it is nice to have a nice crit ratio, don't get me wrong, but especially with the other characters that you use with him, that does make up for a lot of the heat that he can do against enemies. Now let's go ahead and take a look at Constellations. Now with 4-star characters, I'm just going to talk about them. Obviously, if you want to go for the Constellations, you can, but I do think that overall with 4 stars, it's really never a best idea to go for Constellations, but we'll at least talk about them so you know what they do. Looking at the first Constellation, it states that for 5 seconds after Heizou takes the field, his normal attack speed is increased by 15%, and he also gains 1 declension stack for Heartstopper Strike, and this effect can trigger once every 10 seconds. At the beginning of the video, if you see kind of when he initially kind of goes on field from a separate character, if you don't have the C1, he will come out on field with 0 Heartstopper Strike stacks. But when you have the C1, he'll obviously appear with another. And as you saw before, he had none, and then he had 1, and then I switched over to him. Now he has 2, now he has 3. But if you switch to the other characters, kind of go through your rotation a little bit, get Farzan, get Farina out, get Bennett out, and then switch back to Heizou, now he's at full power all of a sudden, and would you look at that, big damage hit. So there's a lot of things that can happen. Obviously, that does not happen only with the first declension stack, but it can happen with multiple, as I just showed you. Looking at the C2, though, it states that the pull effect of the arresting wind tunnel created by Windmuster Kick is enhanced, and its duration is increased to 1 second. Basically, what that means is that you're increasing the pull that you get, which can be nice, especially when you're knocking enemies back by absolutely punching them in the face. It is a little bit helpful. I wouldn't say it's necessarily anything crazy, but the pull is somewhat nice, especially when enemies are trying to, once again, get thrown into next week by your punches from your skill. The increase on the C3 is to the skill, and then the +3 for the C5 is to the burst. Now when we look at the C4, it states that the first Windmuster Iris explosion in each Windmuster kick will regenerate 9 elemental energy for Shikanoin Heizou, which is like almost a quarter of his energy cost. Every subsequent explosion in that Windmuster kick will each additionally add another 1.5 energy for Heizou. One Windmuster kick can generate a total of 13.5, which is, I believe, about 3 extra explosions on top of the initial, so that is kind of extra and nice to see. Overall, when you get to see him, it's just increasing some energy, which is what we normally see in C4s, just some extra energy, which you don't really care about too much. But the C6 is really where it starts to come together, and another reason why I actually was okay with switching down to Solar Pearl, different from when I had the other weapon, which was Lost Prayer of the Sacred Winds, which is why I was okay making Yaimiko's crit ratio a little bit better, and because I knew that the C6 on my Heizou was going to pull a lot of weight. Each declension stack in the C6 will increase the crit rate of the Heartstopper Strike unleashed by 4%, which is giving you a maximum with 4 stacks, which, by the way, when you use Heizou, you should almost never be using your skill before the 4 stacks. Yes, you can, yes, it's here, yes, it's there, but remember the conviction effect is giving another 227.5% at level 12 on top of the initial damage hit. So when you get 4 stacks, not only you're getting the 4 stacks, but you're getting another bonus on top of it. It's just worth it, even if it's an extra second or two. It is definitely worth it to do that much of a higher hit. Also, though, the extra 16% crit rate for having those 4 stacks. So I'm at a 59 right now, but I'm actually at 75 because of the extra crit rate that I get. Also, the C6 states that when Heizou possesses the conviction effect, which is when you have the maximum of 4 stacks, the Heartstopper Strike damage, crit damage, is increased by 32%. So I'm at like 190 something, I'm actually at 220 something. So I'm actually a 75 over 220 rather than a 59 over 190. So there is a pretty nice buff to see when you get the C6, which I think a lot of people, if they do really, really like Heizou, they should go after this. And when Heizou first came out, I actually got Kazuha his C1 at the same time I think when Kazuha came out, because they were kind of on the same banner. But the funny thing is that I got the C1 Kazuha before I got the C6 Heizou. So once again, that just goes to show you, you might get a 5-star you don't necessarily need. Like, I didn't really need the C1 on the Kazuha, but the C6 was almost worth it in my opinion. So if you really do like Heizou, go for the C6. But besides that, I feel like the C1 is probably the furthest that you would maybe want. And then besides that, everything else is just kind of over time, collect them as you get them. Now looking a little bit further, let's go ahead and talk about teams. When it comes to teams with Heizou, once again, all you're caring about is kind of combining characters that are going to buff him, but also help him with that core 4. Now there's 2 different ways that you can kind of go about this. One is the Anemo damage DPS type way that I do, which is throwing Furina in the team, throwing Farazan because I'm trying to increase that Anemo damage, and Bennett just for the attack buff. And obviously Furina's a great character in general here, and so is Bennett. The only one that's kind of almost out the window when you go to a reaction team is probably Farazan. This can also work technically for a reaction team, but I would rather kind of switch out if I was going for a reaction Heizou. I'd rather switch out for Yae Miko or Yelan or Xingqiu if that's the route you want to go. Someone like Diona, someone like Layla, someone that can kind of create some extra hits. Obviously, someone like Fischl is going to be extremely solid. I think Layla, Fischl, Xingqiu, and even some other characters like Beidou or something like that are going to be pretty solid characters to use. Xiangling's another solid option. Any off-field application is going to be highly necessary, especially when it's a part of that core 4. So that's going to be pretty nice. You could use Kuki as your healer. You could use really anyone that would really be helpful for you. But that's kind of the idea when you're looking at a reaction team. It's just throwing together a bunch of characters that are going to be helpful for you. So if you're going for more like maybe a taser team, you might throw Fischl and, Xingqiu together, and then throw Beidou in as the shielder. Just throw on a shield with her. And the other thing is since you're so close ranged, and if you have a higher, thing on your Beidou, you might actually be able to create a bunch of reactions with her as well, because she's also hitting enemies as well, I believe with her burst. So that is kind of the idea. When she throws up a shield, throwing it on Heizou, or kind of that idea, or throwing on her burst, that does then throw Fischl, allowing a lot of reactions, and then Xingqiu is constantly helping because Heizou's doing a bunch of normal attacks, and you're constantly creating the taser effect, or the electro-charged effect, which is just constantly maybe tasering an enemy over and over again. So there's a lot of different ways that you can run it. Obviously, because it is the core 4, you're constantly looking for teams in that way. Overall, you're looking for Pyro, Hydro, Cryo, and Electro for the characters that you're putting with Heizou. So any of those off-field characters. So characters like Yelan, characters like Yae Miko, characters like Furina, characters like Raiden, characters like any of these characters, and I could go on and on and on. That's the idea really when you're looking for that type of team with Heizou. Now, once again, I do think that if the way that you want to run is for a really high damage hit, and for the way that I kind of run him, it might be worth it to just go the way that I use. I do have a C6 Farazan, so that is a little bit different, but honestly the C0 Farazan still works extremely well, because the C0 Farazan still gives a resistance shred on Anemo in her burst, and I believe she still does give an Anemo damage bonus buff as well. So that is still a very, very nice buff to still get. Furina is obviously an extremely solid character for most teams, and in this team, she's extremely helpful, making sure that, you know, you are giving a huge buff to Heizou. And although I don't care about the reactions constantly happening with Swirl, it is nice to see that Furina is still doing damage from off-field, but also helping me get declension stacks by constantly keeping Hydro on the enemies for me to swirl and get those stacks from that passive. Bennett's obviously a great healer and an even better buffer for the attack for someone like Heizou, who might need some extra stats to kind of buff him, considering he's on 4-star stats, not 5-star stats. So I do think that even still, although Heizou is a 4-star DPS, he still hits absolutely insane numbers. I don't think I've really ever run him into a floor 12 situation and absolutely, you know, demolished everything in my stead, but he definitely clears things like floor 11 extremely easily without any problem. And when it comes to the Imaginarium Theatre, he's definitely someone I can depend on in a quick problem. And he does kind of maybe use up some of his charges, maybe on those early stages, just because of how strong he kind of is overall. And he can work with so many different characters as well. So no matter what you're kind of going against, Heizou can at least kind of be there for the Imaginarium Theatre pretty easily. And he has been, at least for me. Hey guys, normally I kind of let you guys just kind of watch whatever's going on to kind of focus on what I'm actually doing during the gameplay section if I have the character and I use them in the gameplay. But the issue that you're going to see probably with this particular run a lot with the Heizou here is that it's going to be a very long run. And this just goes to show that even still, with an extremely good Heizou that I have well built, as well as the C6 and whatnot, even with some of the best characters to focus on some of the most damage, it's still extremely difficult to get him through endgame content. Now in the past, I have actually cleared 12-1 in a minute and a half, and even sometimes sooner, just how easy the Abyss was, or maybe how nice it was towards this Heizou team. But at least here for this specific Abyss, this one has already hurt a lot of people already, and even some 5-stars are having issues with it. So this is why I'm only going to be showing the best team that I'm going to show here, because if I tried to run a reaction team, or if I tried to run any other team that doesn't have the best characters, in my personal opinion, for him to do insane damage, it's very, very difficult to go through and clear this content in the Abyss. But without that being said though, hope you guys enjoy at least the rest of this little bit of the gameplay, just to see at least how he's supposed to work a little bit, looking at how to make sure to get ready for his stacks, for his skill, use him with the other characters in the team.
Gears of the sword. We'll see about that. Wretched dastard. Go in.
Bring it on.
Let's light it up. Strike a pose. Aligning, echoing song. Have fun with this gift. Everybody stand up. Off we go.
Get moving.
Shower me with praise. Let's light. That's gonna hurt in the morning. Time to shine. Teamwork is dreamwork.
Well, that's everything I've got talking about Heizou and kind of looking at him as a character. If you guys did like the video, please go ahead and like and subscribe. Let me know how you guys feel about Heizou. I know I've made one of these recently, quote unquote, with my old channel, and that was talking about Heizou. I did make a new one, and it was kind of a little bit different. There are some new characters that have kind of come out and kind of could have possibly changed things, and I think in even better instances when we get new characters in the future, someone like Mavuika and even Citlali, I think those characters are going to work absolutely insane and extremely well with Heizou as well. So I'm really excited to see how that can work with other characters, but also with the Heizou as well. And even still, some of these characters can, you know, maybe be useful. Even someone like an Ororon, who may not be maybe the ideal character, but if you're going for that electro charge team, it might be really, really nice to have him and use as you're having that constant swirl happening and allowing those reactions to constantly take place. But with Heizou, that's really everything I've got. If you guys have any other ideas, any other teams, how do you guys run your Heizou? How did you maybe build him? Maybe what you're looking forward to in maybe some of the other future characters for him or something like that as well. Let me know down in the comments. Thank you guys though for watching the video, and I'll see you guys in the next one.